Hello, I am Sophia. I am a criminology researcher, instructor, and a passionate supporter of mental health, addiction, and offender rehabilitation.
And my name's Guy Felicella, and I'm a former drug user who had to be brought back to life 6 times and survived for decades living in the downtown east side of Vancouver. And today I have almost 12 years of sobriety.
Thank you so much, Guy. I am so excited for you to be here with me, sharing your story with us. When I first heard your story, it definitely impacted me. I had just finished a criminology research project on stigma, and once I heard your story and I could see scientific evidence meet real life experience, it just made it so much more important for me to raise awareness, especially among youth and teenagers who may be at risk or already struggling during this opioid epidemic that we are experiencing right now. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So just to get our conversation started, Guy, I just wanted to bring up, throughout my career, supporting people who are struggling with mental health, and also as a criminology instructor. Sometimes they say this would never happen to my kids, or this would never happen to our students. This is not something that would happen to kids who come from certain types of families or from certain social circles. It just shows me that people create ideas about the type of person that would experience or struggle with something like this. So based on these comments that I have heard throughout my career, can you please share what type of environment you grew up in?
Yeah, I grew up in a middle-class home in Richmond, mom, dad, brother, sister, nice house, money, things look good, right? And, from the outside, sure. But from the inside, what you couldn't see was domestic violence, verbal abuse, physical abuse. I describe my childhood as often cloudy with a chance of thunder and lightning, very unpredictable. It developed my own anxiety and depression and self-hatred towards myself, but you're surrounded in an environment that's very dysfunctional. And it's all behind closed doors. And, one of the things that really impacted me in my life is that, even though things look like I was happy, I was always distracting myself from sadness. And there's a big difference in our world with people who don't know how to cope with trauma or, undiagnosed learning challenges, or just being different, anxiety or depression. We all think these are something that's wrong with us for having these issues, and the truth is there's nothing wrong with them. It doesn't define you of who you are as a person. It's just my reality is that I was trying to distract myself from dealing with the pain that I couldn't deal with, and I had no outlet for that. And so eventually it translated into me struggling with substances.
Okay, so you mentioned that you did have your mom and your dad. So for those mom and dads that worry about, their children potentially being at risk, could you share with us what your relationship with your parents was like? What was your relationship with your mom and your dad like?
I think my dad's relationship with me is something that very few people would understand. It was very dysfunctional, but also at the same time we had a connection. Mm-hmm. And, when I look back, it was probably me trying to, do everything possible to please them, but I just never measured up to that. So they had a standard, and there was a lot of pressure. I think kids can react differently to pressure or, being, to try to succeed in life and to be something that they don't want to be. And sometimes you get lost in that. And so my relationship with my mom was just very well dysfunctional as well. My mom had a struggle with alcoholism, and, so her, with what was going on in the reality in her world, used alcohol to cope. Mm-hmm. And, eventually I started using drugs to cope.
So I have a question. My students have prepared a series of questions for you. The first question that I have for you is, when was your first exposure to drugs?
Well, I guess my first exposure to drugs is because my background is Italian. And so, I used to steal sips of wine off the table, when I was very young. A couple sips here, a couple sips there. But where I really started to get involved in drugs was was at the age of 12 was the first time I ever used them. But I was at a moment in my life where I wanted to end it. And, it was so painful. And when I found those drugs, the one thing that happened is those drugs saved my life. But what I couldn't understand at 12 years old is that one day they would progress into drugs that were going to try to end my life. And it's a really, but at 12 years old, I was just trying to hang on to anything. And so that's when I started using drugs.
Would you say that there was some peer pressure? Because this is something that people constantly tell me, right? They said, sometimes I've heard them say things like, if they are around people that do drugs, they will do drugs. There's peer pressure there. But if we control what friends they hang around, maybe that won't happen. Do you think, in your experience, did you have peer pressure when it came to using drugs or experimenting with them?
I don't think I was ever, in my world, pressured to do drugs. I wanted to do them. I was searching for something. Same with a lot of my friends at that time. And so I think when you're searching for something, you're willing to try something. And when we found drugs, they worked. I mean, that was the interesting thing. It's like everybody says drugs are bad. And yeah, they can cause a lot of problems. But it's like, why do we live in a world where people are gravitating to drugs? That's the question. And why are there so many people using them? And why is there so many people dying even when they know the risk that these drugs kill? It really kind of takes us to look at unaddressed societal issues that are not being addressed in the first place, the root causes. So our focus is solely on, get off the drugs. But that's not often the problem. The problem is, why the drugs? Why do I need the drugs? And so those are the things that you have to look into. I didn't have peer pressure, though, does impact a lot of people. I think people are wanting, especially youth, they want to be accepted by their peers. And so sometimes they will be willing to cross the line to do something, even if they're not comfortable doing it, just to fit in. And that's where you really have to educate people as well. It's like, what are you going to do if you find yourself in that moment? Like, you're going to do something you don't want to do. And sadly, in this day and age, that can first time experimental drug use can result in death.
That's right. Especially now, you hear about fentanyl and all. I actually have come across a lot of cases in which people never did drugs before, and somebody just gave them something, and then that was the end of it, right? And then we stigmatize people for overdosing, thinking that maybe this is something that they were doing on the daily, but really it isn't always the case.
Well, I think you have many people who use drugs. You have people who struggle with addiction. You have intermittent substance users. You have people who are experimenting. You can't say people who are experimenting with drugs have an addiction. They
Exactly.
don't. And you can't say that somebody has an addiction if they use on a Saturday or on a Sunday and then they go to work Monday to Friday. What they have is that they use drugs. Now, then you also have people who are chaotic in their drug use and struggle with addiction. The tragedy is that all three are dying, whether they have an addiction or not. And so you can't put people into treatment that don't have an addiction. You have to try to understand why is the person using drugs? And there's many reasons why people use drugs, because they help people relax, maybe, take away the anxiety, long day at work. People use substances. And so what we've created, though, is this world where, it's looked upon in a bad way. Now, if you look at unregulated drugs, right, and how they're looked in our society, they're a scourge to society. But if you look at the biggest drug that causes the most harm, which is often celebrated, alcohol, which causes more damage than any opioid on the planet, and yet we become hypocritical to say, well, this is okay. And what we have is we have a drug that's regulated that kills more people than drugs that aren't regulated. So, but one celebrated, often celebrated, and alcohol crippled my family, car crashes, domestic violence, there's sexual assaults, there's stabbings, there's murders, there's so many things that happen with alcohol but yet our focus is really on people who use drugs. And then our only solution to them who use unregulated drugs is you got to go to treatment. Well, going into treatment doesn't address the underlying issues of trauma, pain, and undiagnosed learning challenges.
Right. So on that topic, undiagnosed learning challenges, can you tell us a little bit about what school was like for you?
Well, I mean, when I went to school, you were either smart or you were dumb. And I was dumb. You know, they didn't have a spectrum. You know, I often felt stupid. I couldn't learn like everybody else. Brought a lot of shame, a lot of stigma. And you hide that. And I never shared with, and when I found out I had ADHD, I was 38. And when I found out, I mean, I just started to cry because it was like, oh my God, it all made sense. And I told the lady that I said, I've just felt stupid my whole life, that if I walked into a room of people that I was the dumbest one in it. And she said, no, you're actually one of the smartest ones in it because of how you've had to navigate your life without knowing and how challenging it is. And so once I had started to understand my underlying issues, it became a lot easier to treat the addiction.
Can you please describe any experiences with teachers or principals? We see many kids getting in trouble constantly at school, right? And then they are diagnosed ADHD, right? And then they try to help them somehow. For you, who went undiagnosed, how were your interactions with teachers?
Well, I mean, I only went to school till grade 8.
Okay.
I left in grade 8, but I mean, I had a couple good teachers, you know, but basically they might have been the art class or the gym class,
Yeah.
you know, something that, or the music class, because I liked music. I got along with, in school for me, I did the things that I wanted to do. I didn't do the things that they wanted me to do because I didn't know how to do them, and nobody was showing me how to do them properly. And so if I saw math or English or science, I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. So with ADHD, I lack a dopamine deficiency as well in my body, which means that I'm a high risk, high reward guy just to feel alive on the earth. And so it really started to explain all the things that I did throughout my world just to feel like I was a part of it. And so if somebody were to ask you to take that away, then what would be the point of living? And that's where I was running into, you know, being suicidal at the age of 12. Is because I didn't feel like I fit in the world.
At this point, when you were feeling so low, were your parents aware of how you were feeling?
No, they didn't. I mean, honestly, you know, there was no sit down and talks. There was no coping. There was no, you know, there was no hugs. You know, there's basically, you know, I navigated around my household, you know, knowing where the cracks in the floor were, not to draw any attention to myself, just trying to fly under the radar my whole life, you know, just trying to survive, really.
I have another question from another student. They want to know, at what point in your life did you become homeless?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was homeless as a youth when I started running away from home, but I was home. See, this is the thing. I didn't make a choice to be homeless. The choice was, I didn't make the choice to go live the first 12 years of my life the way I had to live it, right? So when I ran away, I had no choice. I slept in, you know, people's houses or backyards or people's, some families knew. My parents, they honestly didn't really care. The police would pick me up and bring me back home, and then I would leave again. You know, so you're really just kind of so lost. But that's where it started.
At what time did you start becoming involved in gangs?
At the age of 14, I was being groomed by gangs, and you know, that's the one thing about love and acceptance. If you can't find it in the places that you're supposed to, you will seek it elsewhere. And I fit their demographic of people, you know, and they, you know, the one thing looking back is that you know, they were much older than me. They were grooming me for a purpose, for their purpose. And at that age, even if I knew they were grooming me, I wouldn't even have cared because it was love for me. and that I was seeking. And, that changed the trajectory of my life because I had no idea what I was getting involved in. And who could at that age? Gang squad, task force, rival gangs, the imminent threat of death constantly around you. It was just a horrendous challenge to break free from, but also, you don't. There's really two ways out. You go to jail for the rest of your life, or somebody kills you. And so, for anybody that gets them, that's why I try to tell kids that you can't get involved with these guys because it is so hard to break free from. And luckily for me, I was able to do that. But that was a long process.
Another student wants to know once you look back at all this that was happening in your life, what kind of support would you think have made a difference in your journey when you were struggling with addiction? What type of support that you would have found as a teenager would have made a difference?
Yeah, I think when people just solely focus that the drugs were bad, get off the drugs and your life will get better. And when I did get off drugs, my life got better in the sense that I had a bed and a place to stay. But what didn't get better was how I viewed myself as a person. I mean, I was just so wounded inside. And so, that was the one thing that if I look back on, I wish that there was, a little bit more additional to just stopping using drugs. I needed counseling. I needed therapy. I needed a mentor. I needed somebody to take me under their wing. I didn't need somebody to tell me how to live. I needed somebody to show me how to live. And unfortunately, at my young age, I just didn't receive that.
Knowing that now, and I know that you're an expert on your field, some people are fast to say, for example, oh, they should just try, right? They should just try. But we understand from the science perspective that that's not how the brain works when you are addicted. Could you shed light a little bit about the science and this? You mentioned you lack dopamine, right? So is there anything that you can share with students or teenagers or parents about how the brain works when it comes to addiction?
Well, just the first thing to the question about trying, there's a lot of people trying every day.
Right.
Every single day people get up to try to be sober. It's just not that easy. And for me, I celebrate those people who are trying. The thing is that, we look at success as seeing a successful life. We don't attribute that to, I look at success differently. Success is actually in the eye of the beholder. But for one thing, when I see people trying every day to figure things out, addiction is a chronic relapsing condition. And that means you're not going to go walk into a treatment center and stay there for 9 months and then walk out the back door and never use drugs again. People go back 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And sadly, today, people aren't recovering fast enough. They're dying faster just because of the toxicity levels of the drug supply. So essentially what we say is that, you have to work with people. While even if you know what they're doing, you have to work with them. You can't work with them because you're not getting the outcome that you want. You still have to be, how do you work with people when you know they could be using drugs and not judge them and talk to them and try to help them, even though you're not agreeing with it, but you're not judging them for doing it either. And so you really have to understand the story behind the individual before you start pointing fingers at how they're living.
Right. So individualized approach as well. I have a series of questions that are all about breaking the cycle. Though my students, I probably have 10 questions that are all around. How did you find the motivation to recover and break the cycle after years of failure?
Yeah, it took me 31 years. It took me 26 years to get 1 year sober, and then I'd relapse after 1 year. I thought, oh, that's great. 1 year, let's go get high. But that's just the mind. You know what I mean? It's like, let's go celebrate. I got 1 year sober. Let's go get high. It just sounded like a good idea at the time. And then I went back out, and sadly for me, what started to happen is that I had overdosed 6 times after that. I attribute, there's a lot of people that really helped Guy throughout his journey. I just didn't need 1 or 2, but there's always been somebody put in my life at the right time, right moment, at the right opportunity that gave me a little bit of hope when I needed it. And, the last overdose for me was February 18th, 2013 at a supervised consumption site. And when I opened my eyes, the nurse described the whole ordeal as that guy was, he wasn't breathing. He was gone for 8 minutes. We couldn't get him back. We'd done everything we could. And then when I woke up and I looked at her, she was, I've never remembered overdosing either. It's not something that there's a feeling. It's just black. But I've just always remembered opening my eyes. And on this particular time when I opened my eyes, she was visibly emotional. And my response to her was, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I care." And for whatever reason, I just burst into tears. And I told her that I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to die. Like, I know I'm going to die. And at that moment on that floor, I just said, like, I'm either going to die in my addiction or I'm going to die trying to get out. But the one thing I was going to do is I was going to die trying. And at least just put, everything I had into it. And honestly, I did it like it was my job, like my life depended on me doing this. And it did. It really did at that moment. And, here we are.
Would you say then that nurse showing you that kindness and that compassion was pivotal for that finally?
Hers was a pivotal moment, yeah. There was many pivotal moments where people helped me, give me hope. But that was the pivotal moment that I said, okay, you know what? Like now, I think I had done it. I mean, I think in the sense of a person that struggled with addiction, I'd done it every single way you could do it. I went to treatment over, a dozen times. Recovery houses, detox services, incarceration, all of it, institutions, I went through it all, and I realized at the end that the demons that I was battling wasn't out there, it was in here, and it's inside you. And sometimes that just takes a long time to come to grips with and to be able to deal with it. You can't force somebody to be able to deal with childhood trauma that they're not ready to deal with. What you can do, though, is, try to work with them through that, just to say that you're there for them if they need something. I think that is people always remember how you made them feel. They're never going to forget you. They're going to know you for either that you were good to them or that you were bad to them. How do you want to be looked at? And so for me, I just always wanted to be looked at as that, hey, like, you may never get sober, and then you may, but I just want you to know that I'm going to be here to help you.
That is such a great story, and it reminds me of my work helping youth who are trying to exit gangs. And I remember having a moment with one of the youth that I was helping them. I have the same, I was born with this ability to feel empathy and compassion for everybody. And I remember this specific kid. He was exiting the home because he was turning 18. So at this point, he has to leave the home. They're not the problem of the government anymore, right? So they just let them go. So the work that we do helping them is supporting them through that transition when they're alone because they don't have families.
Right.
So I remember telling him, saying, please don't go back to your neighborhood. Come with us, right? Stay with us. We will give you a place. And I got emotional and I started crying. And he asked me the same question. He asked me, why are you crying? And I just continued crying. I care about you. I know that if you go back, this is not going to be a good outcome for you. He stayed with us for a little bit and he was fine. But eventually, once the support, we are not able to support anymore because they're supposed to be on their own. We get them a job and everything. He ended up going back and, it just gives me hope because as you tell me, so many people were pivotal and in your change and your, success. Yeah. So to think that now he's probably 20 years old. I don't know where he's at. He returned to his area and, it just gives me hope to hear your story and how we all need to be educated on how to have compassion for others because if we don't, we are really just impairing their healing.
Yeah.
How do you think, because another area in which that I feel is so important is because as I'm talking to you about learning about compassion and empathy, we have stigma, right, which is a huge problem. And I certainly have seen it in my experience trying to help people and trying to gather support from others. There's a stigma. Even people sometimes will help me, support people that have been probably involved with the law, but they will tell me to keep it on the quiet, right, because they don't want that. So how do you think addressing stigma could make it easier for others like you to recover and reintegrate into society?
Well, I mean, stigma plays a major role in hindering people from reaching out for support and help. It's the main reason why people use drugs alone. It's the main reason when people struggle that they don't reach out. Um, and so it's become just as deadly as those drugs that are on the street. And really, when you look at stigma, it's really how we view a person who is using substances. Like, you're a bad person. And I've often shared with people is that, no, they're not bad people. They just have challenging circumstances. I shared this one time in a school talk, and a 16-year-old kid came up to me after the school talk, and he said, I just want you to know that I appreciate you saying that drug users aren't bad people. He said he lost his dad in 2020 to an overdose. And he said, I don't tell people that. I tell them that he died of something else. And he said, it's because how people talk about people who use drugs. And he said, my dad loved me. He had his challenges. And I said, yeah, your dad loved you, man. And so that's how, this is not even a kid that's using drugs, and he's being stigmatized because of his family. And so often we don't think of how devastating our words can be in people's lives. I'll tell you something. The most crippling abuse that I've ever felt in my life wasn't physical abuse. It was verbal abuse. And I was just always trying to turn the volume down in my head of the negative thoughts and feelings that I projected onto myself, and how that negativity was pushed towards me from the outside developed my own internal negative image, but it also projected it outward. And so, I developed being very angry and resentful. And sadly, we keep repeating these mistakes over and over and over again by how we talk about people who are struggling. And if you, like I said, if you really don't know the story behind the individual, I've never met somebody that hasn't struggled with addiction, that hadn't struggled with sexual abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, trauma, bullying, undiagnosed learning challenges. I mean, it's all there. Poverty, homelessness, these unaddressed societal issues. It's not only that we expect the person to change, society has to change. We have to change. People have to change. How we view people struggling has to change. That rhetoric is only pushing people into the shadows. And sadly, I've witnessed so many people die because of it.
This is where education is so important, and the reason why this project is so important for me is because I was one of those people. And I have a funny story. It's funny now for my friend. My friend, she used to work for Fraser Health, and she supported people with addiction. I don't remember exactly the department in which she worked, but she was an expert on the topic, and I had just started university. And we were both driving downtown Vancouver, downtown East Side, and I said a comment, something I had just started my criminology studies in, and I said a comment, something very ignorant. And I said, I saw a person asking for money, and I said something like, oh, if he only spent the time that he's standing there actually trying to get a job, he would not, he would probably accomplish more. And my friend looked at me and she's like, Sophia, I can't wait for you to finish learning about it and educating yourself about it. And we'll talk about it in a couple of years. And for me, she apologized to me now that I tell her that, but I tell her that conversation was so important to me because I started to get curious. And I was like, okay, she knows something that I don't. And once I started getting involved in it, my perspective completely changed. I am trained in the criminal justice. My bachelor's is in criminal justice. So I was very much trained along, more of a punitive side as much as, we don't want to believe it, right? We are trained in that area. But once I learned and I did all these research projects, I totally It totally changed my perspective. And I think my friend, she actually is embarrassed. She says I shouldn't have approached it that way, but it actually definitely hit that spot that needed to be hit, right?
Right.
So education for me, it's so important in this topic. And so I thank you for sitting here and, sharing with us what you think maybe people need to know that they don't know. Because I was on that side, right? So I know the power of education.
Yeah.
What do you think? Well, before I ask you this question, I have a question from one of my students who said, it's good to give everything a try, but would you say that giving drugs a try is a horrible thing to do?
Well, I mean, I guess you're going to ask, see what drugs is somebody talking about, right? I think drugs is that we live in a world where people use drugs, whether we like it or not. Um, I think, you're going to have people that are going to experiment with drugs. Like caffeine's a drug,
Right.
right? Do you drink that?
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean?
Every day.
Yeah.
Like 3 cups a day.
Smoking, nicotine, like, there's people do try drugs. I think you have to understand that people will. But how do you educate people on what drugs are dangerous and what drugs are not so dangerous is really important in it. And then, like, I always tell people this, any drug that you buy off the street that's not from like a pharmacist or, a store, then you don't know what it is and you could die. And that's how serious it is today in our world. Would drugs be a horrible idea? I mean, for a person who is, these are the tough challenges of the circumstances of somebody's life, right? I know drugs become a reasonable response to people when they're struggling with trauma and pain and it's unaddressed and they can't get help for it. Drugs are not a radical solution for people who are struggling with poverty and homelessness. I mean, I know people homelessness, you'll freeze to death. Drugs actually at least warm you up so you don't think about how cold it is or about how hungry you are. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that you have to address with that. Sure, did drugs cause problems? Heck yeah, they're going to cause a lot of problems in people's lives. But for some people, they don't cause problems.
If you could give advice to teenagers that are having these sort of questions, right? What would be something that you advise them on based on your experience?
Well, I always tell anybody that I work with, like, hey, like, I can only give you suggestions. You have to be the one that has the humility to accept the suggestions, right? So I always say to people, it's like, look, if you're going to struggle and you feel like using drugs, you call me first before you call the dope dealer. After you talk to me, if you want to call the dope dealer, I can't stop you. But at least we can try something. And I'm not going to judge you for calling them either. And then if somebody is using drugs, I also want them to be, like, you can't use alone. Like, you just can't. Like, the sad world that we live in, man. That's, 86% of the overdose deaths. The leading cause of death in British Columbia between the age of 10 to 59 is unregulated toxic drugs off the street. Like, let that sink in, people. That is the number one cause of death. The chances are, if you see somebody on the street or anywhere blue, it's an overdose. You should learn how to use naloxone, and you should use it because you could save a life. And it's the world we live in now. Whether we want to look at it or not, it is here. Right? So we have to prepare and do a lot on the prevention side of things, the awareness side of things, to talk about people's stories of breaking free from the struggles of addiction so that I never tell kids to not use drugs, right? I mean, sure, if that ever stopped people from using drugs, then why hasn't it?
Yeah.
However, when I share my story, it tells kids not to use drugs. Absolutely. And they get it a lot differently because the message is not me being like somebody that's judging them, because they're probably already using drugs, and a lot of them that I'm talking to anyway. But the message gets received differently. And then when people hear the sheer punishment that I went through, and a lot of it was my own doing as well, and a lot of it wasn't. And when they hear just how hard it is to break free, it sure makes you think a little bit differently that, hey, I'm not saying you may wind up in the downtown east side of Vancouver, but I'm also saying I didn't think I'd ever wind up in the downtown east side of Vancouver either.
Right. Coming from especially because of that assumption that if you come from a 2-parent household and you're not struggling.
Money doesn't do anything.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Money makes things easier. Doesn't make you happier. And I've spoken globally. Like any country, town, place I've been to, I don't care. It's not something that you're going to see in the downtown east side. This is in every workforce and every person's lives. Your school teachers, your bank tellers, your tech industry, your stock market. Every single person, there's people through all demographics that use substances, and a lot of them use unregulated substances. And the leading cause of people dying is in private residence. So that's a house like mine, like yours, or like your colleagues and friends. These people aren't dying on the street.
What role do you think schools have in reducing, the risk and supporting their students?
You gotta have people come in and talk. I mean, that's the thing. And people are gonna. When I talk, people relate. So I've had students that never used drugs that got the message. And they understand how challenging it is to use drugs because you're relatable. Naturally, human beings can just relate to people. Kids relate to me through my anxiety and depression of growing up and trying to fit in and being socially acceptable. So they relate to that. And then they also relate to their own things. They may not have an addiction to drugs, but I had so many people come up to me and be like, I'm only allowed to be on the computer for 2 hours a day, but I hide in the closet on the computer because I can't stop. And then they understand how addiction would be easier to move to the Himalayan mountains and become a shepherd than it would be to beat it. So people get the message through different avenues. And the one thing that I'm just, and I'm an open book. I'm not judgmental, but I'm also, when I tell people, it's listen, if you're gonna run the life that I ran, it's gonna be extremely. You're not gonna live. That's the reality. And if you are struggling with drugs, how do we get you to reach out and talk about it? The shame is in struggling in isolation, but we push people to that shame. We don't allow them to be open up, to come in. I'll tell you something. When somebody walks to your door and knocks on it to tell you that they're struggling, I want to let you know that they tried to turn around 5,000 times before they got to your door. And when they finally, that door opens and you sitting there, and you just listen, and then you give them a hug, and you say, hey, I want to help. What can I do to help? Man, it can change everything. That piece of human connection and humanity in a moment where somebody is struggling. Like I said, it's not just you and them. I want you to remember that when you're talking to your students or to anybody. It's you, them, and every bad experience that they've ever gone through in their life, and are you going to be the one that's going to actually make a difference?
Thank you so much for that. That just makes so much sense. And I'm just hoping that this message, is relayed, and somehow my students, they can really grasp everything that you're saying. And the last question that I have from one of my students is, they were very serious. How did you meet your wife?
Everybody asks that question.
Yeah.
I met my wife in 2010, and I met her through her father-in-law. And that was my first year that I'd ever stayed sober. But unfortunately, we were together, but her parents didn't know. And so it was a really complicated relationship. Oh. And when they did find out, they were very angry at her, very angry at me. And they basically, it just wasn't able to work. And I started using drugs again. And I went back to the downtown east side of Vancouver for 2 years in the downtown east side of Vancouver. I'd lost all contact. I mean, I'd said a lot of things to her to push her away in the end. And I went back to just go do what I know how to do, numb myself. And about 2 years later, she was driving through downtown east side, and she saw me out in front of the supervised consumption site. And she got out of her car. She ran up to me, and she gave me a hug. And she put her hands on my face, and she said, this is not who you're supposed to be. I know who you are. And she said, but I can't also wait around for something that's never going to happen. And she said, you need to go get help. And I said, I'm trying. And, logically, you think somebody would be like, I remember my wife, she's very beautiful. And I remember people on the street were like, who was that? And I was like, well, it was my girlfriend. They were like, what are you doing down here? And I tell you how challenging it is. It took me another 6 months before I left. And when I thought she was gone. And I was sitting in jail, and I wrote her a letter. And I told her that I just want to let you know I've never met a person like you in my life, that you always helped me when I needed it. You cared about me. And I said, I'm getting out on this day, and I had already booked into a recovery house. And I said, I know you probably moved on with your life, but I wanted to let you know that if one day I can ever thank you and take you out for coffee, I just want to say thanks for always trying to help. And it's when I got out 3 days later, she showed up, and the rest is really history. And we built this life together. And her response to me is she actually filled in the blanks where I wouldn't have known back then, which made me so angry. Is that her parents at that time made her choose me or her or them. And she said, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I chose them instead of being with the person that I was meant to be with. And, I just, actually, I actually made a joke about it because we were at Starbucks where I said, when she said, if you're all in on changing your life, then I'm all in it to stand with you. And we'll fight this thing together. And I said to her, well, I don't think I have much better choices out there, so I'll take you up on that offer. And you know what I mean? Then the rest is history. Well, and I've never focused. I always tell this to people: don't focus on staying off drugs for the rest of your life. Just focus on staying off drugs today.
Day at a time.
One day at a time.
What a great story! I got chills from that. Your wife must be an amazing woman, also, and that's true love.
She taught me how to live. I mean, she really, believe me, there's a big component of success from a lot of people, but really for her, she was the finishing touch that I needed.
Did spirituality in any way play any role?
Yeah, I mean, I believe in God. That's me, and I God's got a hand of grace. I need a lot of grace in my life, so I've done a lot of things that I regret. So I try to do my best to pay it forward, to help people, and to repair the damage that I caused. And I'm going to share my story openly and honestly in the hopes that other people don't go down the same path that I did. And if you do, I want you to know that I'll help you get the hell out of it too.
Yes, you certainly are making an impact. I've been seeing you, and of course, the internet knows what I'm into researching. So I've been seeing you everywhere. I know you're making an impact. So thank you so much for that, for spreading the word and representing truly that people do change, that society has to play a role. And so society has to educate themselves and learn how we're going to be getting out of this one. It's just not changing. It's only getting worse. So that's also the purpose of this project, is just to raise awareness about how we as society need to change. We need to be open to learning. And also, I have heard you say, if someone, youth or a teenager is ever struggling, they can contact you. I've heard that you are even open in those ways.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I can reach out. Everybody that takes the time to reach out to me, I take the time to reach out back, because I know sometimes how hard it is for people to reach out and ask for help. So I always call back, or I always email back, and try to lend some advice and some suggestions, and really it's just part of what I do to pay it forward. So yeah, I'll keep doing it.
Thank you so much, Guy. This was great.
Yeah.
So thank you for anybody who is listening, and who, especially my students, who had all these great questions for you. And again, thank you for all the work that you're doing, and you have such an amazing story. Congratulations.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you.